The morning started like any other day at the company's headquarters. Employees arrived one by one, carrying their coffee cups, laptops, and files. The sound of shoes tapping against the polished floor echoed through the long corridors. Some people chatted quietly about the weekend, while others rushed to their desks, worried about the busy schedule ahead. Everything seemed normal, but no one could imagine that this ordinary day was about to turn into a story people would never forget. The main conference room was already filling up. A big meeting had been called, and whenever the CEO himself was going to speak, everyone knew it was important. The employees respected him deeply. Not only because he was the top leader, but also because he had guided the company through tough times with calmness and wisdom. He had built trust with his team, and his presence always carried weight. Yet, sitting at the back of the room was one man who didn't share that respect. The young engineer leaned casually in his chair, arms crossed, eyes rolling as if he had better things to do. His attitude was noticed by a few colleagues, but they didn't say anything. After all, it wasn't their job to correct him. The atmosphere grew quieter when the CEO entered. He walked in with a calm step, dressed neatly. In a dark suit, holding a folder in his hand. People straightened in their seats, screens closed, and whispers stopped. There was a certain energy in the air, the kind of energy that always arrived with a strong leader. The CEO nodded politely at the employees and took his place at the front of the room. Everyone expected another inspiring session where he would share updates about the company's progress and the vision for the future. But hidden behind those respectful faces, there were mixed emotions. Some employees were excited to hear about new projects. Others were nervous, worried about possible changes. And a few, like the young engineer, seemed restless, uninterested, even slightly annoyed. He tapped his pen against the table, sighed loudly once or twice, and looked at his phone while others paid attention. His arrogance wasn't new. He had always believed his ideas were better, his skills unmatched, and he didn't shy away from letting others know. But today, his arrogance would take a dangerous step forward. The CEO began speaking, his voice calm and steady. He talked about the challenges the company had faced over the past year, the efforts of every team, and the plans to grow even stronger. People listened carefully, some nodding in agreement, others taking notes. The engineer, however, smirked quietly, shaking his head as if everything being said was nonsense. A woman sitting next to him noticed his expression and shifted uncomfortably. In her seat, she sensed something unpleasant was coming. As the CEO spoke about future strategies, the room was focused, respectful. The only sound was his clear voice and the occasional scratching of pens on notepads. Then, suddenly, a small sound broke the rhythm. A chuckle. It came from the engineer. He leaned back, muttering under his breath, but loud enough for a few people nearby to hear. Their eyes widened, and one or two glanced nervously at the CEO to see if he had noticed. But the CEO continued speaking, ignoring the disruption. His expression unchanged. The tension, however, had started to rise. It was like a storm building in the distance. People could feel it, though no one could predict how big it would become. The engineer, perhaps encouraged by the silence around him, grew bolder. He whispered a comment that made another colleague's jaw tighten. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before his arrogance exploded into something that could not be ignored. And when that happened, the calm morning would transform into a shocking lesson no one in that room would ever forget. For now, though, the conference room sat in uneasy balance. On one side was the CEO, standing with quiet authority, focused on his message, believing in the strength of leadership and respect. On the other side was the engineer, restless and dismissive, ready to challenge the very foundation of that respect. Around them, the employees waited, caught between admiration for their leader and discomfort at their colleagues' behavior. They could feel that something unusual was about to happen, something that would mark this day in their memories. The morning, which had begun so normal, so ordinary, was no longer just another workday. It was slowly turning tense, and soon everyone would understand why. The CEO's voice carried smoothly through the conference room. Every word deliberate, every pause filled with meaning. He had the ability to capture attention without shouting, a gift that made his speeches memorable. People leaned slightly forward in their chairs, eager to hear the vision he was laying out. He spoke about innovation, teamwork, and the future. Of the company, to many, it was inspiring. To others, it was reassuring. But to one man, the young engineer at the back of the room, it was nothing more than empty talk. He shifted in his chair, his arms crossed tightly, eyes narrowing as the CEO's words flowed across the room. His lips curled into a half smile. But it wasn't one of respect. It was one of disbelief. He whispered something under his breath, but this time a few people caught it. What nonsense! The colleagues near him froze. They wanted to shush him, but fear held them back. No one wanted to be dragged into what was clearly becoming dangerous ground. The CEO, still unaware of the growing arrogance in the corner, moved to the whiteboard and began sketching an outline of the company's next big strategy. His hand moved confidently, explaining each step with clarity. That was when it happened. The engineer suddenly raised his voice, cutting through the respectful silence. "This is ridiculous," he declared, his tone sharp, dripping with mockery. The sound of his words hit the room like a slap. Every head turned in his direction. The scratching of pens stopped. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed louder in the silence that followed. The CEO slowly turned, his hand still holding the marker. His eyes met the engineer's, calm but focused. He didn't say anything, not yet. Instead, he gave the man space to explain himself. But the engineer, encouraged by the sudden attention, leaned forward on the table, ready to show off his confidence. "You keep talking about the future, about growth, about innovation," he said, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "But let's be honest, here your ideas are old, they're outdated. You're stuck in the past, and you expect us to follow you like sheep." His voice carried across the room, thick with arrogance. He gestured broadly, as if the entire company had been waiting for him to speak the truth. Gasps echoed among the employees. A woman in the front row dropped her pen. A man in the back shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Never before had anyone dared to speak this way to the CEO, especially not in a public meeting. The engineer's words weren't just disagreement, they were an open insult. He had crossed the line, but the engineer wasn't finished. He leaned back with a smirk, letting his words hang in the air. "This company needs real leadership," he added, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Not outdated speeches and empty promises." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Some employees stared at the table, afraid to look at the CEO. Others glanced nervously at each other, their faces pale with shock. They knew this wasn't just a bold move, it was career suicide. But the engineer didn't see it that way. He saw himself as brave, as someone unafraid to speak truth to power. He believed he had just exposed weakness. The CEO, however, did not flinch. He placed the marker gently on the board tray, turned fully to face the room, and then let his eyes rest on the engineer. His face was calm, almost unreadable. There was no anger, no visible frustration, just a quiet authority that seemed to fill the space. The engineer's smirk grew wider. He thought the silence was victory. He thought he had shaken the CEO's confidence, that he had shown the room who was smarter, sharper, stronger. He imagined whispers of admiration, colleagues secretly applauding his courage. But the reality was different. The employees were horrified, not impressed. They weren't admiring him, they were waiting, breath held for the inevitable response. 1. Man in the middle row adjusted his glasses nervously, thinking, "Does this engineer know what he's doing?" A woman near the door folded her arms tightly, whispering to herself, "This will not end well." The CEO finally moved, but not with anger. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, his steps measured, his presence commanding. Each step seemed to build the tension higher, like a drumbeat before a storm. He stopped, folded his hands in front of him, and looked directly at the engineer. The silence stretched, unbearable, but the CEO didn't rush. He let the weight of the moment sink into every heart in the room. The engineer shifted slightly, the smirk still on his face, but now mixed with a flicker of unease. The silence wasn't what he expected. He had expected outrage, shouting, maybe even a heated argument. Instead, he got calmness, a calmness that felt far more dangerous. The room remained frozen in suspense. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe too loudly. It was as if time itself had slowed down. The engineer sat back, arms crossed again, preparing for whatever came next. Still convinced he had the upper hand. What he didn't know was that this moment, this single outburst, had already sealed his fate. And the next words from the CEO would not only silence him, but also remind every person in that room of the true meaning of leadership. The tension in the air was no longer just heavy, it was explosive. And the spark had already been lit. Asterisk, the words of the engineer still floated in the air like smoke after a firecracker. The conference room was silent, yet that silence was louder than any noise. Every person felt its uncomfortable heaviness that pressed against their chest, making it hard to breathe. Some employees stared at the table, avoiding eye contact with both the engineer and the CEO. Others stole quick glances, wide-eyed, trying to read the faces around them. No one wanted to be the first to speak, because everyone knew this moment was dangerous. The engineer leaned back in his chair, his smirk still plastered on his face. To him, the silence felt like victory. He thought he had shaken the room, forced people to see him as the brave one who dared to challenge authority. But what he didn't realize was that the silence wasn't respect for him, it was fear. Fear of what would come next. Fear of the storm that everyone knew was about to break. A woman in the front row tightened her grip on her pen so hard it nearly snapped. Her eyes flicked toward the CEO, then back to the engineer. She had worked at the company for years, and she knew the CEO's style well. He wasn't the kind of man who shouted or lost his temper. He was the kind of man who let his actions speak louder than words. That was what made the silence so terrifying. Everyone knew he was thinking, calculating, preparing his response. At the far end of the table, an older employee cleared his throat softly, as if to break the tension, but quickly stopped when no one joined him. The air was thick, heavy, like a room holding its breath. Even the buzzing of the projector seemed louder than normal. The engineer's mocking laugh had poisoned the atmosphere. And now everyone sat frozen, waiting. The CEO still hadn't moved. He stood at the front, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the engineer. He didn't glare, he didn't frown, he simply looked. That look carried weight. It was steady, calm, almost too calm, and it made the engineer shift slightly in his seat. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face, but pride kept him steady. He crossed his arms again, forcing a grin, as if he wasn't intimidated. People in the room whispered quietly, barely moving their lips. One whispered, "He's gone too far." Another muttered, "Does he even realize what he's done?" The whispers faded quickly, drowned by the silence that kept everyone chained in their seats. The shock wasn't just about the insult itself. It was about where it happened and to whom it happened. This was no ordinary meeting. This was the CEO, the man who had taken the company from near collapse to success. The man who had earned respect not just for his position, but for his wisdom. For someone to insult him publicly, so openly, in front of everyone, it was unthinkable. It was more than disrespect. It was betrayal. One of the junior employees near the door stared at the engineer with disbelief. He had once admired him, thought of him as brilliant, bold, a man with strong ideas. But now, all he could see was arrogance. The insult didn't look like courage anymore. It looked like pride eating a man alive. The engineer, still blind too. The truth tapped his fingers on the table and let out a short laugh. "Well," he said softly, though loud enough for people nearby to hear, "I guess no one wants to admit I'm right." That comment sent another wave of discomfort through the room. Several employees looked at the CEO again, desperate for him to finally respond to put an end to this unbearable tension. But the CEO remained still. His calmness wasn't weakness, it was power. He was letting the engineer dig his own grave. And everyone could see it happening in real time. The shock in the room grew heavier with every second of silence. Employees could almost feel the line that had been crossed, and once crossed, there was no going back. It wasn't just the engineer's job at risk, it was his reputation, his entire career. And everyone watching knew it. One woman near the middle of the table lowered her head, whispering a quiet prayer under her breath. She didn't want to witness what was coming. She didn't want to remember the downfall of a colleague she once thought had potential, but she also knew there was no stopping it now. Finally, the CEO moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, closing the small distance between himself and the employees seated at the table. Every eye followed him, every heartbeat quickened. But he didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply looked at the engineer one more time, his expression unreadable. The silence deepened, the shock in the room reaching its peak. The engineer swallowed, his grin faltering for just a moment. Something in that calm gaze unsettled him, though he would never admit it. He tried to straighten his posture, to look confident, but the unease was creeping in. The room could feel it. His arrogance was beginning to crack. What the employees didn't know was that the CEO was preparing to reveal something. Something that would change the way everyone looked at the engineer forever. But in this moment, the room remained frozen in shock, caught between the insult that had already been spoken and the response that had not yet come. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way. And when it did, no one would ever forget it. The room remained in uneasy stillness. The insult had been spoken. The shock had spread like fire, but the CEO had not yet said a word. He stood at the front of the room, still, calm, almost statuesque. His eyes rested on the engineer, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a quiet power that made people uneasy. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that made hearts beat faster and palms sweat. The employees waited, tense and restless, their eyes darting between the engineer and the CEO. They expected shouting. They expected an explosion. Of anger, maybe a heated argument. That was how most leaders might react when insulted publicly. But the CEO was different. He didn't need noise to show strength. He didn't need to prove anything with loud words. His silence alone was enough to shift the balance of the room. The engineer sat back in his chair, arms folded tightly across his chest, still wearing that smug grin. At first, he believed the silence meant victory, that the CEO had no answer, that his words had landed like a blow. He thought he had exposed weakness, and he enjoyed the thought. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, the silence became unbearable. His grin twitched. He shifted slightly in his seat. Something about the CEO's steady gaze felt heavier than any shouted insult could ever be. One employee in the front row thought of it like standing in front of a mirror. The CEO's silence was reflecting the engineer's arrogance back at him, showing everyone in the room exactly who he was without saying a single word. Another employee at the far end clenched his fists under the table, silently begging the engineer to stop, to realize the danger he had walked into. The CEO finally moved, but not with sudden anger. He placed his marker neatly on the table, straightened his posture, and slowly walked toward the long conference table where everyone sat. Each step was calm, measured, and deliberate. His polished shoes echoed softly against the floor, and with each sound, the tension grew thicker. No one dared to look away. No one dared to breathe too loudly. It felt as if the entire room was being pulled into the gravity of his presence. When he reached the middle of the table, he stopped. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't slam the table. He simply rested his palms lightly against the wood, leaning forward just enough to meet the engineer's eyes at level. The entire room felt the shift. Power had moved. Authority had settled. Without saying a single word, the CEO reminded everyone why he was the man in charge. The engineer's smirk faltered for a moment. He tried to recover, clearing his throat, shifting in his seat, but his confidence was slipping. That silence, that calm, was not weakness. It was strength. It was control. And he could feel it pressing down on him harder and harder with every second. A young employee whispered under her breath, barely audible, "This is worse than shouting." She was right. Shouting would have ended quickly. But silence stretched, silence burned, silence forced everyone to face the truth. And the truth was clear: the engineer was alone in his arrogance, while the CEO stood unshaken. Finally, the CEO spoke, but his voice was soft, almost gentle. "Are you finished?" he asked. Just 3 words. Simple, calm, but powerful. They cut through the engineer's arrogance like a blade. The smirk disappeared completely now, replaced by a flash of confusion. He had expected anger. He had expected a fight. He didn't know how to answer calmness. The room felt it too. Relief mixed with fear, because those 3 words weren't the end. They were the beginning. Everyone knew the CEO had just opened the door to something bigger. Something that would not only address the insult, but would reveal truths the engineer was not ready to face. The engineer tried to laugh, a nervous sound that cracked slightly. "Yeah, I'm finished," he muttered, though his voice lacked the boldness it carried minutes ago. The silence returned immediately after his words, and once again, it was the CEO who controlled it. He straightened his back, looked around the room, and let his gaze settle on each employee. He didn't need to explain the gravity of what just happened. They already felt it. His silence had done what no loud reaction could have done. It reminded everyone of the unshakable foundation of leadership. Respect wasn't commanded through fear or force. It was commanded through presence, through patience, through the kind of calm that made arrogance look small. The engineer sat there, shrinking in his seat, though he tried to keep his face straight. Inside, however, unease grew like a storm. He had underestimated the CEO. He had thought arrogance would overpower authority. But now, under the weight of silence, under the gaze of a leader who didn't need to prove himself, he realized he might have made the biggest mistake of his career. The room remained on edge. Employees didn't know what would happen next. But they knew one thing for certain. The CEO's silence had spoken louder than the engineer's insult. The power in the room no longer belonged to the arrogant man who mocked. It belonged entirely to the leader who stood calm, composed, and in complete control. And though no one could see it yet, the silence was only the first step. What came next would be a revelation that would change everything. The engineer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence slipping like sand through his fingers. The silence had already cracked his pride, but he didn't know what was about to come next. The CEO straightened, clasped his hands behind his back, and took a slow breath. His eyes swept the room, then returned to the man who had dared to insult him. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, calm, but every word carried the weight of a hammer. "You know," the CEO began softly, "it's interesting to hear you talk about leadership, about innovation, about being stuck in the past." His gaze didn't leave the engineer. "Because I've had to spend the last few months reviewing your work." A ripple of shock ran through the room. Heads turned sharply toward the engineer. His smirk froze. His eyes widened just slightly, but he quickly tried to recover, leaning back in his chair with a forced grin. "My work speaks for itself," he said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. The CEO tilted his head, still calm, still unshaken. "Yes," he replied. "It does. And unfortunately, what it speaks of is carelessness, arrogance, and a complete lack of responsibility." Gasps echoed across the conference room. Pens dropped. A few people covered their mouths. The engineer sat straighter now, the blood draining from his face. "That's not true," he muttered quickly, his bravado faltering. "You're exaggerating, but—" The CEO raised a hand slightly, and the room fell silent again. His authority was absolute. "The board has reviewed your last 3 projects," he continued, his tone sharp but controlled. "Each one was filled with errors that cost us time and resources. Your designs looked brilliant on the surface, but they lacked depth, structure, and accountability. Instead of accepting feedback, you dismissed your colleagues, ignored warnings, and pushed forward as if your word was final." Murmurs broke out among the employees. Many had seen glimpses of the engineer's arrogance, but had never dared to speak about it. Now, hearing it laid bare by the CEO himself, they realized how deep the problem ran. The engineer's hands clenched the edges of the table. His voice rose, desperate. "That's not fair. Those mistakes weren't mine." The CEO's voice cut cleanly through his protest. "The mistakes were yours, and the cover-ups were yours too." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on the man across from him. "Do you think the board doesn't see the truth? Do you think your colleagues haven't spoken up? Respect doesn't come from pretending to be the smartest in the room. Respect comes from accountability, and that is something you have never shown." The words hit the engineer like blows. His face burned red, his mouth opened to argue again. But no words came. His arrogance, once so loud, was now choking him. The silence of his colleagues around the table only made it worse. None of them defended him. None of them nodded in agreement. They all sat quietly, their loyalty clearly with the man at the front of the room, the man who led with truth, not with arrogance. The CEO stepped closer, his voice calm but unyielding. "You called me outdated. You called me out of touch. Let me tell you, something innovation doesn't mean disrespect. Leadership isn't about insulting others, and progress is impossible without humility. You see, the very future you laugh at is the one you're no longer going to be part of." The engineer's eyes widened, panic flashing in his expression. His smirk was gone, his confidence shattered. For the first time that morning, he realized the ground beneath him was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The employees sat frozen, their hearts pounding, their minds racing. The truth had been revealed in a way they had never expected. The man they once thought was bold and fearless was being stripped down to nothing in front of their eyes. And the CEO wasn't raising his voice, wasn't lashing out. He was simply telling the truth. That calm, sharp truth was more powerful than any anger could ever be. One woman near the back whispered softly to herself, "This is it. This is the end for him." The CEO let the silence stretch again, letting his words sink deep into the minds of everyone in the room. Then he spoke one final sentence that sealed the engineer's fate. Arrogance may build noise, but it never builds a future. The engineer slumped slightly in his chair, his face pale, his confidence gone. The truth had been laid bare for all to see. And though the final decision hadn't yet been spoken, everyone in the room already knew what was coming next. This wasn't just about one man's insult anymore. It was about respect. It was about accountability. And the truth had made it clear. Who deserved to ladand, who no longer had a place among them. The room sat in absolute silence after the CEO's words. The truth had been revealed, and it had struck like lightning. The engineer, who once carried himself with arrogance, now sat small and stiff in his chair, avoiding everyone's eyes. His earlier confidence had drained away, leaving only the heavy shadow of embarrassment. But what came next wasn't only about him. The CEO knew this moment was bigger than one man's downfall. It was about everyone in that room, about the entire culture of the company. He stepped back slightly from the table and let his eyes sweep across the room. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. His calmness carried more power than shouting ever could. The employees leaned forward almost unconsciously, waiting, hanging onto the silence that had become his weapon. Respect, the CEO began, his voice steady, is not a gift. It's not something handed out freely. Respect is earned, every single day, through our choices and through the way we treat others. He paused, his eyes catching those of several employees. Some lowered their heads, others nodded slowly, realizing the depth of what he was saying. He turned slightly toward the engineer, who sat frozen in his chair. When you insulted me today, you believed you were showing strength. You thought arrogance was the same as confidence. But let me tell you, this true confidence never needs to belittle someone else. True confidence builds people up. Arrogance tears them down. And tearing others down is not strength, it's weakness. A murmur of agreement rose quietly among the employees, but quickly faded as the CEO raised his hand lightly. His eyes softened, but his tone remained firm. I've seen this mistake too many times. People believe talent is enough. They think intelligence alone will make them succeed. But intelligence without humility is a dangerous thing. Talent without respect is poison to any team. The words hung in the air like heavy stones. Several employees shifted in their seats, thinking about their own behavior, their own attitudes. Some recalled moments where they, too, had dismissed. Others, or rolled their eyes during meetings, or failed to listen. The CEO wasn't just speaking to the engineer anymore, he was speaking to all of them. The engineer tried to speak, his lips parting as if to defend himself again. But the CEO's gaze silenced him before any words could form. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't anger. It was something stronger and unshakable authority that made excuses worthless. The CEO walked slowly to the far end of the room, his hands clasped gently behind him. His calm footsteps echoed, marking each word as he spoke. This company was built not just on ideas, not just on projects, but on trust. Trust that each of us will respect the other. Trust that each voice matters. Trust that even in disagreement, we don't insult or belittle. That is how we survive. That is how we grow. He stopped and turned, facing the entire room at once. His presence filled the space. If we lose respect, we lose everything. Without it, no innovation will survive. Without it, no team will last. Without it, no leader will stand. The employees sat quietly, their eyes fixed on him. The weight of his words pressed into their hearts. They realized this wasn't just about discipline, it was about the core of who they were as a company. The tension that had begun with one man's arrogance had now become a lesson for everyone. One junior employee near the door felt goosebumps rise on her arms. She thought to herself, this is the kind of leadership people write books about. It's the kind of lesson you remember for a lifetime. The engineer, however, sat stiff, his pride broken. For the first time, he realized that his behavior wasn't bravery, wasn't boldness, was foolishness, but it was too late. The lesson wasn't for him alone anymore. It was for everyone watching, for everyone who would carry this story with them long after this day was over. The CEO's voice softened slightly as he spoke again. We are all human. We all make mistakes, but the difference between those who rise and those who fall is humility. The willingness to admit, to listen, to learn. Without humility, even the smartest person in the room will eventually collapse under their own pride. His words cut deep, not like a knife, but like truth carving itself into the minds of those who listened. Employees nodded slowly, their expressions thoughtful, some even ashamed of their own past behaviors. They understood. The CEO looked around one final time, then returned to his place at the front. Let today be remembered, he said firmly, not because of the insult, but because of the lesson. Let it remind us all respect is the foundation of success. Without it, brilliance means nothing. A wave of quiet agreement rippled through the room. It wasn't applause, not yet. It was something deeper, silent acceptance of the truth. The turning point had come. The insult, once a shocking wound, had transformed into a lesson so powerful it would echo for years. And though the engineer sat defeated, shrinking under the weight of his own mistake, the others in the room felt stronger. They had been reminded of what truly mattered. They had been reminded of the kind of leader they followed. The morning that began with arrogance was now reshaped into a memory of respect. It was no longer just a meeting. It was a turning point, and everyone knew it. The conference room had fallen into a heavy silence once again. The CEO's words about respect and humility still echoed in everyone's minds. The engineer sat frozen in his chair, pale and restless, his earlier arrogance stripped away. His fingers tapped nervously on the table, the sound small but sharp. In the quiet room, he wanted to speak, to argue, to save himself, but his throat was dry. Deep down, he knew the moment had already passed. The CEO stood tall at the front, his calm presence filling the space. He let the silence stretch, not out of hesitation, but out of purpose. He wanted everyone to feel the weight of what had just happened. He wanted the lesson to sink deep into their bones before he spoke again. Finally, his voice broke the silence, steady and clear. This company cannot afford arrogance. This team cannot afford disrespect. And this organization cannot afford to keep someone who insults, belittles, and poisons the very trust we work so hard to build. Gasps swept across the room. Every employee knew what was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud sent a wave of shock through their bodies. Some shifted nervously in their seats. Others stared wide-eyed at the CEO, unable to believe they were about to witness what no one thought could ever happen in such a public setting. The engineer's face drained of color. His smirk was gone, replaced by a look of disbelief. "Wait," he stammered, his voice cracking. "You're not serious." The CEO didn't raise his voice, but his words cut like steel. "I am serious. Effective immediately, you are terminated from this company." The room exploded in silence. It wasn't noise. It was the absence of it. The stunned hush of dozens of people processing what they had just heard. Eyes darted between the CEO and the engineer. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. It was the kind of moment that people would remember for years. The day arrogance was punished not behind closed doors, but in the very room where the insult had been thrown. The engineer pushed back his chair violently, the legs screeching against the floor. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice breaking with panic. "I've given years to this company. You need me." His words were desperate, clinging to the last threads of pride he had left. but the CEO's face remained calm, his tone unshaken. No one is above respect. No one is above accountability. You may have skill, but skill without humility is dangerous. And this company will not be led or destroyed by arrogance. A murmur rippled through the employees. They weren't murmurs of protest. They weren't whispers of sympathy. They were murmurs of agreement. For the first time, the truth was visible to everyone. The man they once thought of as confident had revealed himself to be toxic, and the CEO had revealed the strength to cut that poison out. The engineer's eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but found none. Every face looked away, or stared firmly at the CEO. No one came to his defense. No one offered him a hand. He was alone. Security quietly entered the back of the room. The sound of the door opening made the engineer's heart pound. He shook his head furiously. No, this isn't happening, he muttered under his breath. But the reality was unavoidable. The CEO spoke one last time, his voice calm but final. Please collect your things and leave the premises. This meeting will continue without you. The security guards stepped forward, their presence professional but firm. The engineer stood slowly, his hands trembling. For the first time, the arrogant smirk was gone completely, replaced by raw panic and humiliation. He glanced one last time at the room, at the colleagues who once respected his skills, hoping to find pity. But all he found was silence. As he was escorted out, the sound of his footsteps against the floor felt heavy, final. No one clapped. No one cheered. But in their hearts, the employees knew they had just witnessed a moment of justice, a reminder that no matter how high someone thought they stood, arrogance could bring them crashing down in an instant. The door closed behind him, and the room exhaled collectively, as if releasing the weight they had been carrying since the insult was first spoken. Some employees glanced at one another, their expressions a mix of shock and respect. Others stared at the CEO, admiration glowing in their eyes. The CEO stood quietly for a moment, letting the silence settle once more. Then he spoke, his tone softer now, but still strong. Let this be a reminder to us all. Respect is not optional. It is the foundation of everything we build together. Without it, even the brightest among us will fall. This time, there was no silence. A wave of applause erupted through the room, not loud or wild, but steady and heartfelt. It wasn't just for the CEO's decision, 'twas for the lesson. The strength and the example they had all just witnessed. The firing wasn't just the end of one man's career. It was the turning point for the entire company. A day that would be told and retold as a story of leadership, humility, and the price of arrogance. And as the applause faded, one truth remained clear in every heart present. No one would ever forget the morning when arrogance was fired in front of everyone. Asterisk. The door clicked shut behind the engineer, and with it, the weight that had been pressing down on the conference room seemed to lift. The air, once thick with tension, felt lighter, though the silence that lingered was not the silence of fear. Anymore, it was the silence of reflection. Every person in that room knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. The CEO stood at the front, his hands resting gently on the table. He didn't smile, he didn't boast, and he didn't revel in what had just happened. He simply allowed the moment to breathe, letting the gravity of it settle into the hearts of those watching. He knew the scene would be remembered long after this day ended. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost soft, but every word was sharp enough to carve itself into memory. Today was not about one man's downfall, he said, glancing slowly around the room. It was about what we stand for. This company will never be built on arrogance, will never be sustained by disrespect, and it will never be led by those who believe they are greater than the people they work with. The employees sat still, absorbing each word like stone absorbs water. The CEO's tone carried no anger, only truth. His lesson was not for the engineer who had just been escorted out. His lesson was for those who remained. He continued, "Humility is not weakness. Respect is not optional. And leadership is not about standing above others. It's about standing with them. If we forget that, we lose everything." There was no applause this time, not immediately. There was something deeper than applause filling the room, a sense of unity, of shared understanding. Each person replayed the morning's events in their minds, realizing how close arrogance had come to poisoning their workplace. They realized how fragile respect could be, and how powerful it became when defended. One young employee, sitting near the back, thought of how he had once admired the engineer's boldness. But now, that admiration was gone, replaced by something stronger: admiration for the CEO's quiet strength. He whispered to himself, "This is real leadership. This is what it means to guide people." Another employee, older and experienced, closed her notebook slowly. She had seen many leaders in her lifetime, but none who had handled such an insult with such calm authority. She knew this day would become a story told to new employees for years, a warning against arrogance, and a reminder of the respect that held the company together. The CEO's words stayed with them as he gently closed the folder on the table. He didn't need to say more. The lesson was complete. But as he prepared to leave the room, he turned back one last time. "Never forget," he said firmly, his eyes sweeping across the faces of his team. "Respect is the foundation of success. Without it, even the brightest among us will fall. Remember this not because of what happened today, but because of what we are building together. Our future depends on it." This time, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't forced. It wasn't just for the CEO. It was for the truth they had all witnessed. It was for the strength of a leader who didn't need to shout to be heard. It was for the lesson that had been carved into their hearts forever. The applause faded, but the story didn't. Long after the meeting ended, long after people returned to their desks, whispers spread across the building. People retold what they had seen, their voices filled with awe. Some described the silence that had crushed arrogance. Others spoke of the firing that had stunned the entire room. But everyone agreed on one thing: the CEO's calm power and the lesson of respect would never be forgotten. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. New employees joined the company, and inevitably, someone would tell them the story. Did you hear about the day the engineer insulted the CEO? Did you hear what happened next? The tale became part of the company's culture, passed down. Like folklore, a reminder of the values they upheld. Outside the company, too, the story spread quietly. Partners, clients, and even competitors heard whispers of it. And while the details changed with each telling, the lesson never did. Arrogance destroys, but respect builds. As for the engineer, his name slowly faded. People remembered the event, but not the man. What remained was the lesson, the living memory of how arrogance met silence, how disrespect met truth, and how pride met its fall. The CEO never mentioned the incident again. He didn't need to. His actions had already spoken louder than words. He continued leading as he always had, with calm, humility, and strength. And every time he entered a room, people remembered that morning, and they stood a little taller, listened a little closer, carried themselves with a little more respect. Because some moments don't end when the meeting ends. Some moments echo. They shape the culture. They shape the people. They shape the future. And this moment, the morning, when an engineer insulted a CEO, not knowing he'd be fired in front of everyone, was one of those moments. It became more than a story. It became a lesson, a warning, and a truth carved into the heart of every person who witnessed it. a lasting lesson, one that would never be forgotten.